We've all seen images of the famous statue at the Old North Bridge in Concord, Massachusetts, depicting a classically handsome citizen soldier with a chin like an anvil, stepping away from his plow and picking up his musket to go fight for his country. And below him, emblazoned on granite, the opening stanza of iconic transcendentalist poet Ralph Waldo Emerson's Concord Hymn. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Powerful words and a powerful image. It's no wonder that the story of the Minutemen has reverberated throughout history, and their legacy has been claimed by Americans of every conceivable ideological stripe. For reformers and revolutionaries, the shot heard around the world was like a starting pistol that kicked off a race for American socio-political change. Progressive politics, therefore, are continuing the work of an unfinished revolution. Whereas conservatives and reactionaries, for whom the Minutemen are exemplars of the hard-scrabble rural individualist ideal, believe that the founding of the Republic represented a kind of systemic perfection. They feel like they have to protect the status quo to honor the Minutemen's sacred memory. But for the purposes of this video, I want you to try your best to forget about all that shit. If you can, leave all that baggage at the door, and let's try to understand the Minutemen as human beings. There's a particular reason I want to do that. It's because I feel a personal connection with these people. I grew up off of Stonebridge Road in Wayland, Massachusetts, and our house was in a forest called Pod Meadow. In 1775, Wayland was the eastern parish of the town of Sudbury, and the area around Pod Meadow was called the Lanham District. Most people think that Stonebridge Road is named after a conspicuously stone bridge nearby that spans the Sudbury River, but the bridge was originally called Stone's Bridge, after the Stone family, who had some homesteads nearby. When the British marched to Concord, Sudbury sent more troops to battle than any other town in the county, 6 companies of militia and Minutemen. The largest of these companies, made up of 92 men, came from the Lanham District, my old neighborhood. So if I was born a few centuries too early and grew up in my same hometown, I pretty much damn near certainly would have enlisted in the militia of Captain Moses Stone. And 250 years to the day, to the hour from the time this video was published, I would have been marching my sleepy ass up toward Concord to shoot at the King's soldiers. So I want to get to know my former neighbors. I can't just knock on their doors and bring them a bottle of wine. Well, I could, but I'd get in trouble with the Wayland DPW for grave desecration. So I guess making this video is the next best thing. Who were these people? What were their lives like? How did they see themselves? And how did these pretty ordinary, unexceptional farm boys suddenly find themselves in battle lines, facing off against the regular military of the most powerful empire on Earth? Hey, so really quick, I want to show you something I'm working on for Frozen 50s Man, my web series. Check it out. All right, so what are we looking at here? This is a video of a model train going through a messy-ass room with this really obviously fake-looking backdrop. Like, this looks like dog shit. What is this? Why did I film this? What on earth was going through my head? This looks terrible. Well, not after my VFX artist Blair Rowan got through with it. Blair took this very bizarre, very demented-looking footage and made it look amazing. I've been lucky enough to find friends and collaborators who work with me on all sorts of things for my channel and beyond in all kinds of different roles. I mean, we've got actors, producers, VFX artists, composers, and these people deserve to be compensated for their work. In fact, one of our biggest production expenses at Atun-Shei Films are wages. And most of that money comes from viewers like you. So if you like Atun-Shei Films, if you appreciate the work that we do here, I really hope you'll consider joining us on Patreon. Patrons get all sorts of benefits, from behind-the-scenes material to access to an exclusive Discord server, extra videos, and more. Other great ways to help the channel would be to give a one-time donation via PayPal, to buy merch or memorabilia from our online store, or buy or rent The Sudbury Devil, our historical feature film. You can find links to all that stuff down in the description or over on my website, atunsheifilms.com. To understand the Minutemen, we have to understand the militia culture of colonial Massachusetts. And that story starts in the Old Country. In the 16th century, France and Spain had modernized their militaries by establishing professional armies trained in the tactics of gunpowder warfare. England, meanwhile, resisted such expensive and transformative reforms until the specter of Spanish invasion in the 1570s forced Elizabeth I to establish train bands, or a defensive network of local militia made up of merchants and yeoman farmers. Crucially, exactly the same sort of people who would soon become radicalized into Puritan theology at the dawn of the 17th century. But in practice, the train bands ended up being a pretty pathetic military force. Ill-trained, ill-equipped, and full of opportunists who joined up just as a ploy to avoid overseas service, these militia companies would have realistically posed absolutely no threat at all to a determined French or Spanish invasion. But the train bands were cheap to maintain and better than nothing, so they remained a fixture of English military life through the reign of James I. But then Charles I, as he typically did, decided to shake things up. He dissolved the train bands in the 1620s and set about organizing what he called the perfect militia, a huge national army levied by lord lieutenants who ignored traditional systems of impressment. It wasn't long before the perfect militia, on its way to and from seaside ports to fight Charles's foreign wars, began terrorizing the English countryside, especially in the Puritan stronghold of East Anglia, which just so happened to be close to the army's major embarkation points. With the assaults and robberies they suffered at the hands of King Charles's troops fresh on their minds, Puritan immigrants to New England brought with them a healthy distrust of standing armies, a misgiving they passed on to their descendants. In Massachusetts, Puritan settlers devised a militia system which sought to correct the flaws of both Elizabethan train bands and the Carolean perfect militia. They returned to Elizabeth's original intent of militia members being recruited from the respectable Burgess class. At first, officers were elected by their companies, but this proved chaotic. Later in the century, town militias were administered by sergeant majors with county-wide authority. The sergeant majors played a role much like that of the lord lieutenants back in England, except their powers were strictly controlled by a system of checks and balances established by the colony's citizen-led, democratically elected general court. As English settlements in Massachusetts expanded inland, they intruded further and further into the traditional homelands of Native American nations. In Middlesex County towns like Concord, Sudbury, and Watertown, which 100 years later would become the nexus of early revolutionary activity against the British Crown, militia companies became a necessity of frontier life, and by and large, communities were expected to provide for their own defense. In 1675, King Philip's War broke out, and warriors of the Nipmuc Nation attacked Middlesex County. During the indigenous raid on Sudbury in April 1676, a small company of Concord militia were caught in a native ambush and butchered almost to a man. Among the dead was James Hosmer, whose descendant Abner Hosmer, 21 years old in 1775, was a fifer in a company of Minutemen from Acton. Positioned in the front line of rebel troops at the Battle of Concord, he was immediately killed during the opening British volley, making him the first non-commissioned soldier to die in the Revolutionary War. Another of the corpses in Sudbury belonged to Joseph Buttrick, an ancestor of Concord militiaman Major John Buttrick, who, after watching Hosmer fall, gave the order to return fire over the Old North Bridge. The Sudbury fight was an unmitigated disaster and something of an inauspicious start to the combat experience of the militia of Middlesex County. But it began a 100-year tradition of continuous military service among the landholding families of eastern Massachusetts. From 1676 to 1776, every generation of Englishmen in towns like Concord would form up into companies and go to war, sometimes multiple times over the course of their lives. Like the train bands, at first town militias were intended only for defense. But when the 9 Years' War broke out in Europe in 1688, neither England nor France was willing to send troops to reinforce their colonies across the Atlantic. In the North American theater of the war, the, quote, Bostonians, as New Englanders were collectively called by the Quebecois and their indigenous allies, were on their own. So, for the first time, colonial militia went on the offensive against a fellow European power. In 1690, an invasion force of New Englanders 500 strong sailed from Boston to capture the French fort at Port Royal, in modern-day Nova Scotia. Later that year, they besieged Quebec City, but were repulsed with heavy losses, in part because their French opponents had faced them with a combination of local levies and regular troops. The 18th century dawned, England became Great Britain, and more wars against French Canada followed. This time, the regular British military began to take more of an interest in intercolonial conflicts. Over the course of the next 50 years, a distinctly American form of military organization developed to meet the unique challenges of the so-called French and Indian Wars. Locally organized colonial companies and professional British regulars working hand in hand, operating on a continental scale. A few of the soldiers who marched to Concord on April 19, 1775, had actually fought in these conflicts. Minuteman Captain and future Continental Army General John Nixon of Framingham had his first taste of combat as a teenager at the Siege of Louisbourg, Nova Scotia in 1745 during King George's War, where he remained over the course of a bitterly cold winter and survived a smallpox outbreak. He joined the Massachusetts provincial forces again in the French and Indian War and fought in 3 campaigns in Canada and upstate New York. And while most Minutemen were not old enough to have taken part in these battles, almost all of them had older male relatives who had, and they drew from the cultural memory of that martial heritage. Minuteman Sergeant Caleb Moulton Jr. of Sudbury, 29 years old in 1775, operated a tavern at the corner of Stonebridge Road and Old Connecticut Path with his father, Caleb Moulton Sr. Caleb Sr.'s name is on the muster roll for active duty in the militia in April 1757. He was probably stationed at Fort William Henry in New York for a time, but it's unknown if he was present for the infamous massacre there later that year. So by the time Britain decisively defeated French ambitions in North America by completing their conquest of Canada in 1760, the towns of Middlesex County could rightfully boast that 3 generations of their citizens had contributed to the victory. And that hometown pride is an absolutely crucial part of how people in rural Massachusetts understood their place in society. The most relevant power structure to these people's lives was their town. When a Minuteman thought of their political identity, they didn't think of themselves as Massachusettsers or Britons or, God forbid, Americans. They thought of themselves as men of Sudbury, men of Acton, of Framingham, of Lincoln, of fucking Danvers, fucking Billerica. And it's no wonder, given the generally small scale of their lives. Though towns like Lexington and Concord are today exurbs of Boston, in the 18th century these were sleepy rural communities. Sudbury, the largest town in Middlesex County, was home to only about 2,000 souls. In the years leading up to the Revolution, most future Minutemen in Concord were teenagers working on subsistence farms. Today, we might think of having lots of children as a financial burden, but to a farmer in colonial New England, your kids were your workforce. Farmers in Concord were actually infamous for pressuring their sons to stay at home and work at the family farm well into adulthood. In 1774, Minuteman Stephen Barrett, though in his mid-20s, was still living with his parents and attending lessons at the Concord schoolhouse with children as young as 6. Embarrassing. School was only in the winter, though. Most of his year was spent doing back-breaking farm work, squeezing every ounce of productivity from his father's 150 acres. And even though the populations of Middlesex County towns were relatively small, there never seemed to be enough land to go around. And in some municipalities, this had been a pressing issue for more than a century. This was not because of the number of humans, but because of the number of animals, especially cows and pigs. Animal agriculture, which European settlers had introduced to the continent in the Columbian Exchange, is inherently an extremely inefficient use of land. Minuteman Captain and Concord Town Selectman David Brown, for instance, required 3 3/4 acres of pasture just to sustain a single cow for a year. But animal farming represented most Massachusetts farmers' only profit margin. Their fields and patches of rye, beans, potatoes, and corn was what they lived on. Their cows and pigs are what they sold to be able to afford store-bought necessities like salt, sugar, linen, and wool. Concord had its own slaughterhouse, and Sudbury its own tannery, where animals would be killed, butchered, their body parts preserved, and loaded up onto wagons bound for ports like Boston and Salem. And then they'd head across the ocean, especially to the Caribbean, where plantation owners dined on New England beef. Farmed animals are what connected the Minutemen and their families to the global market. But farming wasn't the only way to make money. 18th century Yankees loved to drink, and in 1776, Sudbury was home to 11 taverns within its eastern parish alone. Moulton's Tavern on Stonebridge Road had to compete with Bent's Tavern, which was only a quarter mile up Old Connecticut Path. According to local legend, this area was so booze-soaked that it earned the nickname Happy Hollow, today the name of a nearby elementary school. As embarkation points for stagecoach lines and way stations for cattle drovers, Taverns were places where goods, gossip, and cash poured into the community. They were assembly places for social clubs and revolutionary militant groups alike. Since meeting houses were unheated, taverns even sometimes served as ersatz courthouses and places of worship on particularly cold winter days. If you could go back in time and drink at Moulton's Tavern, you'd order your drink from the landlord at the bar, which had a wooden portcullis overhead that could be lowered from the ceiling at night to protect the liquor. The most popular drinks at Moulton's were probably apple cider, rum, or cocktails with a rum base, like the Loggerhead and the Flip Dog. Whatever the fuck that is. Beer, Madeira wine, gin, and brandy may have also been available. As the crisis between Crown and colonies deepened from 1763 to 1775, taverns were where the people met to talk politics, and many Massachusetts taverns took on a sharply partisan character in the lead-up to the Revolution. Middlesex County was deep Whig territory, but some Tory taverns also sprung up in this period, such as the Golden Ball Tavern in Weston, whose proprietor Isaac Jones was quietly known as the, quote, friend to government. The Golden Ball was a loyalist watering hole, a meeting place for British spies, and was admired as one of the most luxurious and spacious taverns in Massachusetts. According to one redcoat, it was the, quote, equal to most in England, which I'm choosing to interpret as academic proof that Weston is now and always has been a town of preppy assholes, whose high school football team fucking sucks, and they would have fought for goddamn King George in the goddamn Revolutionary War because they're nothing but a bunch of fucking losers!
Well, it's happened again. Racist graffiti at a school, and this time it's at Wayland High School.
It wouldn't be long before political debates in the taverns became much more than an intellectual exercise. By the early 1770s, there had already been years of protests and unrest in Boston against British taxation. Rural towns in Middlesex County had watched the turbulence in the city escalate with growing concern. However, their participation in these issues had thus far largely been pretty passive. The towns were ideologically sympathetic and had participated in boycotts of British goods some years prior, but many were not yet willing to plunge headlong into Sons of Liberty-style radicalism. Predictably, there was more hesitation among the older generations and people with economic ties to imperial interests. But the Overton window was rapidly shifting, and with judicial and county-level officials compromised by British influence, town government was becoming the bedrock of organized resistance. In 1772, in response to the British tightening their control over colonial courts, the Boston Board of Selectmen established a committee of correspondence tasked with reaching out to the other town governments of the province. On the committee was Samuel Adams and many leading members of the Sons of Liberty. The committee's letters proclaimed that Parliament's, quote, plan of despotism was nearly reaching its completion. They urged every town in the province to take decisive action in defense of liberty and coordinate a unified response to the British assault on their God-given rights. Public outrage over the Tea Act late in 1773 caused more dominoes to fall. Tories and moderates urging caution and humble redress were quickly getting drowned out by a rising chorus of newly radicalized Whigs. After the Boston Tea Party, Parliament's revenge was swift and severe. Not only did they famously close the port of Boston to trade, they attempted to completely dismantle Massachusetts's democratic institutions. The royal governor was no longer required to work with a council of elected representatives. He had complete authority to appoint whatever judicial and bureaucratic officials he liked. And outrageously, town meetings held without his express permission were now illegal. A paper shield is better than none, and the 1691 Charter was the only legal guarantee of Massachusetts's rights and liberties. With these truly intolerable acts, Parliament had effectively just wiped their posh little asses with it. Town government, the sacred inheritance bestowed upon Middlesex County by their beloved, idealized Puritan forefathers, was under direct attack. And as the military arm of those governments, the militia knew where their loyalties lay. Once news of the intolerable acts reached Massachusetts in July 1774, events started moving very quickly. In late August, over 150 delegates from towns all over Middlesex County met in Concord to determine a plan of action. A few days later, rumors that a battle had broken out over a powder magazine in Cambridge led to thousands of militiamen all across rural Massachusetts taking up arms and marching on Boston. The rumors turned out to be false, but the immediate willingness of town militias to resort to violence hammered home to Whigs and Tories alike just how close the province was getting to the brink. The militias had been painfully slow to react to the powder alarm, so beginning in late September, several towns voted to establish a specialized military force in case of a real emergency. Unlike the militia at large, made up of white townsmen of all ages and skill sets, this would be a crack unit of dedicated and well-trained young men in their late teens and early 20s. On September 26th, the town of Concord declared that,
"We vote that there be one or more companies raised in this town for enlistment, and that they should choose their officers out of the body so enlisted, and that said company or companies stand at a minute's warning in case of an alarm, and when said company should be called for out of town, in that case the town pay said company or companies reasonable wages for the time they were absent."
The proclamation was somewhat misleading. The enlisted men invariably elected officers who were already long-standing militia leaders drawn from the middle and upper classes, and there was nothing reasonable about the Minutemen's wages when in town for their weekly drills, which only paid about half of what an average laborer made in a day. As a result, it took Concord a few months to raise their 2 minute companies, as they were called. Once the quota for troops was filled in December 1774, the Minutemen were required to abide by the following regulations set by a town committee. Interestingly, even at this late date, it began with a pledge of loyalty to the king.
1. We, whose names are hereunto subscribed, will, to the utmost of our power, defend His Majesty, King George III, his person, crown, and dignity. 2. We will, at the same time, to the utmost of our power and abilities, defend all and every of our charter rights, liberties, and privileges, and we will hold ourselves in readiness at a minute's warning, with arms and ammunition thus to do. 3. We will, at all times and in all places, obey our officers chosen by us, and our superior officers, in ordering and disciplining us, when and where said officers shall think proper.
Going through the names of men in the minute companies of Middlesex County, you'd be forgiven for thinking you were looking at a genealogical chart, not a muster roll. John Buttrick's Concord Company had 10 sets of brothers, 10 sets of first cousins, and 10 sets of nephews and uncles. The Sudbury lists are brimming with Hayneses, Noises, Rices, Goodenows, Maynards, and Stoneses, many of them the same families which had colonized the valley in the 1630s and 40s. By this time, the newly formed Massachusetts Provincial Congress had subsumed the town governments under its authority and undertook the enormous logistical challenge of stockpiling weapons and ammunition in Concord, including from Boston, right under the noses of the British troops, where provincial agents smuggled muskets out of the city under piles of manure and cartridges hidden in candle boxes. For the Minutemen, the winter of 1775 was spent in anxious anticipation and endless drilling. As one Sudbury soldier remembered later in life,
"The orders were for every man to be supplied with a gun and bayonet, cartridge box and 36 rounds, our guns to be kept in good repair. Trainings were as often as once a week the 3 fall months, in the winter not so often. The young men in the winter months made a practice of calling on their officers in the evenings, and going through the manual exercise on barn floors. I have exercised many a night with my mittens on."
Meanwhile, in Boston, General Thomas Gage, the king's military governor, had no practical way to bring this rapidly deteriorating situation under his control. It was one thing to declare his authority over the towns of Massachusetts. Enforcing it was quite another. Gage was keenly aware of just how far Parliament's reach exceeded its grasp in the province. He estimated that he needed about 20,000 troops to subdue the nascent rebellion, but with less than 6,000 regulars in Boston under his command, he had no real dominion beyond the gates of the city. He, too, was stockpiling arms and ammunition. His troops occasionally made sorties into the countryside as a show of force, but the displays accomplished very little except angering local townsfolk, and a truly impotent expedition to acquire cannons in Salem ended in confrontation with local militia that very nearly turned bloody. As winter gave way to an early spring, the British found themselves in an alarmingly weak position. Realistically, there was nothing for Gage to do but await reinforcements, but London was growing impatient. The rebels were stockpiling more and more weapons with every passing day. In his letters to Gage, Secretary of the Colonies Lord Dartmouth expressed concern that the longer they postponed an attack, the more organized provincial resistance would become. The course was clear. The arsenal in Concord needed to be seized or destroyed. As the people of Middlesex County waited in sickening suspense for Gage to make his move, they began to see ghosts in every shadow. In one almost completely forgotten incident in late February, paranoia about a plot by enslaved persons to, quote, destroy the white people swept across eastern Massachusetts. Two free men of color from Natick, Thomas Nichols and William Benson, were accused of plotting to take advantage of the chaos to, quote, entice diverse servants, read slaves, to desert the service of their masters. Though there was absolutely no hard evidence for this conspiracy, Nichols and Benson were arrested and incarcerated in the Concord town jail. Just south of Framingham and Sudbury, Natick was a former praying Indian town that, in the 18th century, had become a haven of sorts for the region's non-white population. Miscegenation between whites and people of color was illegal in Massachusetts at this time, but Africans, Native Americans, and mixed-race people could marry each other. Nichols had moved to Natick some years prior, bought land, and married a part indigenous woman. Slavery was not common in Middlesex County, but a few well-to-do Minutemen owned them. Young Stephen Barrett, for one. The Reverend William Emerson, a prominent Concord revolutionary and owner of the mansion that still to this day overlooks the Old North Bridge, enslaved a man named Frank Benson. Coincidentally, the brother of that same William Benson accused of fomenting slave rebellion. However, the revolutionary cause was not an exclusively white phenomenon. Native Americans of Mohican descent enlisted as Minutemen in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. 35 of them joined an English-led company, while others formed a minute company of their own under Captain Solomon Captain Solomon I can't do it. I can't do it, guys. While others formed a minute company of their own under Captain Solomon just, you know what? Algonquian viewers, fucking please just correct my horrendous pronunciation in the comments. This is the name. This name has defeated me. What am I supposed to do with this? I'm just a young white boy from Wayland, Massachusetts.
Well, it's happened again. Racist graffiti at a school, and this time it's at Wayland High School.
In addition, black soldiers from Middlesex County started serving in the Massachusetts Army, the predecessor of the Continental Army, at a very early date. Service records tell us that in the direct aftermath of the battles of Lexington and Concord, 2 black men in Sudbury with family ties to Natick enlisted and saw combat at Bunker Hill. Many more men of color from the area would enlist after that. After the Revolution, there wouldn't be another integrated American army until the Korean War. But in any event, it was in this tense, paranoid atmosphere that on March 29, 1775, rumors began circulating that a British attack on Concord was imminent. Truthfully, Gage was still twiddling his thumbs in Boston, but the false alarm ended up being a windfall for the Patriot cause, because it prompted the Provincial Committee of Safety to begin secretly removing their accumulated stores of weapons, food, clothing, and tools out of the Concord arsenal and into the surrounding towns for safekeeping. Any attack the British now made on Concord would be, in some sense, doomed from the start. On April 15th, Gage relieved 800 of his grenadiers, light infantry, and marines of their normal duties on the pretext of learning new exercises. The ruse fooled no one, and word of the order spread to Concord with almost comical swiftness. Then, finally, on April 18th at around 11 p.m., the British regulars boarded transport boats, which took them out of Boston and across the Back Bay to Cambridge. Several dispatch riders and alarmed civilians, of which Paul Revere was only one, immediately began stealing through the countryside, warning everyone they could find that the regulars were coming out. Alarm bells sounded, and militiamen all over Middlesex County rolled out of bed and grabbed their flintlocks. The March of the Minutemen had begun. News of the regulars' advance reached Concord at about 1 a.m. on the 15th. According to tradition, Colonel James Barrett appointed 2 brothers as couriers. One rode north to Acton and Stowe, one south to Sudbury and Framingham. The eastern parish of Sudbury started ringing its alarm a little after 3 a.m. Caleb Moulton Jr., the 30-year-old sergeant in Nathaniel Cudworth's Minute Company and proprietor of Moulton's Tavern, probably jolted awake around that time. He lived on the south side of town, and so had further to travel than many of the men in his company. After throwing on some clothes, a cartridge box, and a powder horn, he would have rushed up Old Connecticut Path toward the assembly point, the training field on the north side of the parish. As the East Sudbury militia and minute companies converged in the training field, the night air would have been buzzing with rumors and speculation. It probably felt more like a social gathering than a military expedition. The Minutemen had been training all winter, but it's important to remember that these were still citizen soldiers, many of them pimply adolescents. They didn't have the deadly serious military discipline of the British regulars. The Minute Company for Sudbury's western parish was led by John Nixon, a grizzled, imposing veteran. But an officer like Caleb Moulton, relaying orders to a bunch of restless 20-year-olds, was a tavern keeper with no military experience. These men were dedicated to the cause, but I think Caleb was much more representative of your average Minuteman that morning than John. And he probably would have felt it too, right? Maybe a little bit over his head? We can speculate. Possibly because of Nixon's extensive military experience, the Minutemen of West Sudbury were quicker to mobilize than just about any other Minute Company, except for those within Concord itself. Just behind them was another West Sudbury company, the 60-man militia of Captain Aaron Haynes. Though not Minutemen, Haynes's company was drawn from the western parish's northern neighborhoods, and many of their homes were within walking distance of the Concord town line. Nixon and Haynes were accompanied on their march by the superior commander of all Sudbury militia, Colonel Ezekiel Howe. The sun rose as they marched, and at around 7 in the morning came the first news of a shootout between regulars and militia on the Lexington town common. Few in Concord or in the approaching militia companies put much stock in the rumors, at least at first. The idea that British soldiers would fire into a crowd unprovoked was truly shocking, almost unbelievable. Surely they'd just been firing blanks to scare the Patriots off. When Nixon and Haynes's companies were half a mile from Concord's South Bridge, young Stephen Barrett rode up to them and relayed orders from his father, Colonel James Barrett, that the Sudbury units were to rendezvous with Concord troops above the North Bridge, about a mile downriver. Both bridges were now being strategically guarded by British detachments, as the main force of regulars scoured Concord town center for rebel munitions. But one man accompanying the Sudbury Minutemen, 80-year-old Josiah Haynes, protested the order. Josiah's name is not on the muster rolls, and he was probably just some civilian who tagged along with the Minute Company to get a chance to shoot redcoats. The old man urged Nixon to attack the British at the South Bridge and press on into the village. Captain Nixon, who by this time next week would be a colonel, understood the value of military discipline. Cooler heads prevailed, and Nixon turned his company north. Along the way, the Sudbury companies stumbled across the house of Colonel Barrett himself, which was in the process of getting searched and ransacked by regulars. Their counterparts in the Concord militia were quite literally fighting in their own backyards. Even now, smoke from British-lit fires in the town center was rising over the tree line. Colonel Howe declared that if the British had spilled any blood at the Barretts, then he would order Nixon and Haynes's companies forward and go in guns blazing. He disguised himself as a civilian and rode closer, only to see that while the Brits had made a hell of a mess, the Barrett family and their enslaved laborer were unharmed. Violence had been narrowly avoided once again, but clearly this was a pimple that was ready to pop. Meanwhile, the Concord militia, their ranks recently swelled by minute companies arriving from Acton, Littleton, and Lincoln, stewed in suspense on the summit of a nearby hill, watching the same smoke drift up into the spring sky. By around 9:30 a.m., Lieutenant Joseph Hosmer had had enough. He turned to Major Buttrick and said,
"I have often heard it said that the British have boasted they could march through our country, laying waste our hamlets and villages, and we would not oppose them. And I begin to think it is true. Will you let them burn the town down?"
Shamed into action, Colonel Barrett ordered the companies to advance. The fifers played a song called The White Cockade, as 400 minute and militiamen marched in double file toward the bridge. The British detachment on the other side of the river, only about 100 men strong, scrambled to form ranks. A few of them tried to pull up the boards of the bridge. In response, Major Buttrick ordered the men to quicken their pace. Then the regulars fired some warning shots into the river, but the Minutemen kept coming. At last, when the Americans had gotten about 75 or 80 yards from the bridge, a single shot burst from a British Brown Bess. The ball whizzed through the lines of militia and minute, sailing under a colonel's arm before grazing a fifer and a Minuteman. A heartbeat later, a full volley of musket fire erupted from the British line. Captain Isaac Davis of Acton was shot through the chest and killed instantly. Abner Hosmer took a .75 caliber slug through the skull, doubtless showering his brains all over the men behind him. Buttrick instantly gave his famous order, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire!" And the rebels paid the redcoats back in kind. The American Revolution had officially begun. At this point, the advancing West Sudbury companies were, in the words of one early 19th century Concord historian, but a short distance away. They were almost certainly in sight of the bridge, surely watching the shootout unfold with a mixture of excitement and horror. After an exchange of fire that lasted just 2 or 3 minutes, the badly outnumbered British turned tail and fled back toward town, pursued by the combined strength of Colonels Howe and Barrett. Soon there was an almost complete breakdown in military order on both sides. Individual militia units split off from the main army of provincials to snipe at small groups of regulars. British troops were spread out all over the town, ransacking homes, harassing civilians, or simply looking for a bite to eat or a stiff drink. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, overall commander of the British forces that day, wasted time waiting for his wounded officers to receive medical treatment. Smith didn't give the order to retreat until around noon. The regulars abandoned their dead and many of their wounded and began the long march east, back to Boston, as more than 1,000 armed men from town militias all over the county converged on their location. Among them was Caleb Moulton and the East Sudbury Minute Company of Nathaniel Cudworth, who marched up to the scene of the action through Lincoln. Once the company rounded Walden Pond, they would have been within earshot of the escalating gunfire at Merriam's Corner on Lexington Road, as militiamen hidden behind trees and stone walls took potshots at the sickeningly exposed British column. As the Minutemen grew closer, they would have come across a truly disturbing scene. An ordinary New England country road, surrounded by idyllic farmland and shaded under the happy spring buds of pines and maple trees, strewn with corpses and caked in gore. The bodies of British regulars cooling in the mud, their limbs twisted in all sorts of grotesque configurations. Soldiers and civilians alike running back and forth, either to the battle or away from it, screaming bloody murder. Cudworth's company ran smack dab into the regulars as they were escaping the ambush at Merriam's Corner. It was out of the frying pan and into the fire as the East Sudbury men charged forward and poured volley after volley into the mass of disorganized, exhausted redcoats. Writing in the 1820s, Reverend Edmund Foster of Littleton remembered how it was every man for himself on the road that day. During the chaos, James Hayward, also of Littleton, found himself in a Mexican standoff with a lone British soldier. "You are a dead man," said the redcoat. "So are you," replied Hayward, and both fired their muskets at the same time, killing each other. According to family tradition, Josiah Haynes, the bloodthirsty 80-year-old from Sudbury, shot a British sergeant. He ran out from cover to steal the man's gun and cartridge box in full view of his squad, who then all fired at Haynes at point-blank range. Miraculously, the old man escaped unscathed, only to fatally catch a bullet at Lexington a few hours later. It was total chaos. The Americans chased the British all the way past Lexington town center, where they were rescued by a force of 900 brigadiers that Gage had hurriedly sent west that morning. But the provincials were receiving reinforcements too, more and more every hour, as minute and militia companies from as far away as Danvers and Salem swelled the numbers of rebel troops to well over 3,000. The fighting continued right up until sundown, when the battered and humiliated regulars at last reached the safety of Charlestown. The die had been cast, the pimple popped. Rebellion had transformed into revolution. In the course of just 15 hours, the geopolitical equilibrium of New England had been shattered, and along with it, the traditional militia system. Over the following weeks, the town militias encamped around Boston would be reorganized into the regiments of the Massachusetts Army. The Minutemen were no longer needed to defend their local communities, but to join ranks with men from other towns, counties, and colonies to undertake a large-scale, long-term siege of the British-held city. The citizen soldiers needed to become simply soldiers. Over the centuries, the term Minuteman has essentially come to refer to any provincial soldier who fought in Lexington and Concord that day. But of course, most of the Americans at that battle were just standard militia. Some were even just civilian bystanders who picked up a gun. In addition, a lot of Minutemen didn't actually make it to Concord in time to take part in the fighting. If the guys from Groton and Salem had a hard time making it to the battle before dark, what hope did the indigenous Minute Company all the way over in Stockbridge have? But the legend of the Minutemen nevertheless caught the popular imagination. The Minute Companies, ready to go at a minute's notice, is exactly the kind of catchy, bite-sized historical tidbit that goes culturally viral. But in terms of the things that matter, their participation in the event, their dedication to their cause, their simple, relatable humanity, there really should be no difference in how we choose to remember the militia and minute companies. Caleb Moulton wasn't some kind of superhero. He was just a bar owner in my old neighborhood. But as 1775 wore on, these tavern keepers, farm boys, and mechanics found themselves swept up in events of global consequence, sharing a stage with kings, planters, merchants, and philosophers. The shot heard round the world would multiply like a cancerous cell and make an entire continent bleed.